The rain fell hard that morning, unrelenting, cold, and heavy. Puddles formed quickly beneath the rusting metal fence surrounding the small county auction yard. In the corner, tied loosely to a crooked wooden post, stood a German shepherd with matted fur, trembling from the cold. His coat, once likely sleek and commanding, now hung in wet clumps. One of his hind legs bore the scar of an old injury, and his right ear had a slight bend from past trauma. Around his neck was a fading red collar, and hanging from it, soaked and sagging, was a cardboard sign, "Rejected canine, for auction." He did not bark, he did not whine. He simply stood there, head low, eyes dull and distant, as though waiting for someone who would never come. People passed by, some with curiosity, others with pity, most with indifference. Poor thing. Probably seems too much. Not worth it anymore. Damaged goods. He wouldn't last a week on a farm. No use. None of them stopped. 17 miles away, in a creaking old farmhouse at the edge of a dying wheat field, Fred Morgan awoke to silence. The house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that only comes after loss. His hand reached across the bed instinctively, searching, but found only the cold emptiness where his wife had once lain. Mary had passed 6 months ago, taken too soon by the slow cruelty of cancer.
Sold for
Since
$1.
then, Fred had lived day to day, moving through life like a man carrying invisible weights. The farm was falling apart. The drought had stolen the season. The well was nearly dry. The soil cracked beneath his boots. The sheep were thin, and the barn leaned sideways, as if exhausted from standing all these years. Fred's back ached more often now, and sometimes he forgot to eat until the sun was already down. That morning, he drove into town to check his mailbox and pick up a few supplies he probably couldn't afford. The general store had a flyer taped to its window, the corners fluttering in the wind. He paused and read it aloud under his breath. Government K9 auction. Everything must go. Trained dogs. Low prices. No questions asked.
Refused to give up.
He stared at it for a moment, longer than he meant to.
Sold for $1.
He wasn't looking for a dog, but maybe he was looking for something. Anything that would make the day different from the one before. He folded the flyer, tucked it in his coat pocket, and drove over. The auction was held in an open shed behind the old county fairgrounds. There were about a dozen dogs in crates or leashed to posts, most of them strong, alert, with the stance and discipline of former working dogs. People gathered in small groups, murmuring and pointing. Bids went out for German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Labrador Retrievers. One by one they were claimed, all except one. He stood apart, not in a crate, but tied to a corner post. The same dog from the rain, his fur still damp, though someone had tried to towel him off. His eyes remained distant. The auctioneer's voice called
Sold
for bids.
$1.
Trained explosives detection, retired early, previous injury to rear leg, no current service status. Bidding starts at $10. Nothing. $1? Fred stepped forward. $1, he said. Heads turned. A few people chuckled. One woman muttered, "He must be crazy." But Fred didn't care. He wasn't buying a dog. He was answering something he couldn't name, something in those eyes that mirrored his own pain. The auctioneer blinked, shrugged. Sold. $1. Fred walked up slowly. The dog didn't move. Fred knelt down, looking into his face. "I guess we're both a little broken," he whispered. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." He took the leash gently and stood. The dog hesitated, then followed. Step by
Sold
step,
for
they walked
$1.
away together. Fred would later name him Hope. The drive home was quiet. Fred glanced at the German Shepherd in the rearview mirror from time to time, but the dog sat motionless, staring into nothing. He didn't react to the bumps in the gravel road or the steady squeak of the windshield wipers. When they reached the farm, Fred parked near the barn and opened the truck door. The dog, still leashed, stepped out without resistance, but with no sign of interest. He followed Fred up the porch steps like a shadow. Inside, Fred laid down a folded blanket near the fireplace and placed an old flannel coat on top. He set a bowl of water beside it, opened a can of beef stew, and scooped it into a tin dish. The dog sat in the corner, still, thin, ribs faintly visible beneath his coat.
$1.
Fred nudged the dish toward him. "You hungry, boy?" he asked quietly. No response. The dog lay down, facing the door, and closed his eyes. Fred sighed. Figures. Should have known better. He left the dish where it was, and walked to his chair by the window. Outside, the sun dipped behind the barn, lighting the fields in gold. Fields that once grew strong crops now lay empty and gray. It all felt like memory. For days, nothing changed. Fred fed the dog, refreshed the water, and kept an eye on his leg. He named him Hope, but Hope barely ate, drank only enough to stay alive, and never made a sound. He lay by the door all day, curled by the fire at night. No barking, no whining, no tail wagging. Fred began to wonder if Hope had given up entirely. Then one night, Fred woke to a strange sound, a faint, trembling whimper. He sat up and listened. It came again, from the living room. Barefoot, he crossed the cold floor and found Hope on his side, legs twitching, breath short and uneven. His jaws clenched. He was dreaming. No, trapped in something deeper. Then came another soft cry. It was the first sound Hope had made since arriving. Fred knelt beside him, gently draped a blanket over his back, and placed a hand on his shoulder.
From
"It's
auction
all right,"
reject
he
to
whispered.
farm hero.
"You're safe
Follow
now."
Hope, the
The next
canine
morning, Fred
warrior
called an
who
old friend who had
refused to
trained
give up.
dogs in the army. They talked for nearly an hour.
Sold for $1.
That was when Fred learned the truth. Hope had served in Afghanistan for nearly 3 years as an explosives detection dog. He had saved at least 3 soldiers' lives. But during one mission, a blast went off too close. Hope survived, but he changed. He stopped responding to commands. He withdrew, froze during training, avoided eye contact. They discharged him as unfit for continued service. No handler claimed him. Fred sat in silence afterward, thinking of Mary. How after her diagnosis, she had slipped into the same silence. The fear, the distance. Sitting on the porch, staring into the distance like she
From
was already
auction
fading.
reject to
Hope
farm
wasn't being
hero.
difficult.
Follow Hope,
He was in pain.
the canine warrior
From then
who
on,
refused
Fred
to
began
give up.
talking to him. Short phrases, small stories about
Sold
the
for
weather,
$1.
the sheep, the farm. He read the paper out loud sometimes. He hummed the songs Mary used to sing. Hope never responded, but he stayed close. A week passed, then another. One cold morning, Fred walked into the living room and found the tin dish empty, completely licked clean. Hope sat by the window, watching the sheep with quiet focus. Fred crouched beside him and smiled. "Good boy," he said softly. "Maybe there's hope for both of us." Winter came early that year, and came hard. By late October, snow had already blanketed the ground. By November, everything was buried beneath thick, unrelenting
auction
white.
reject to
The sky
farm
stayed
hero.
gray,
Follow
and wind
Hope,
roared across the
the
plains,
canine
slamming
warrior
into the
who
old
refused
farmhouse.
to give up.
Inside, Fred did what he could to stay warm.
Sold for
He lit the
$1.
wood stove daily, but his firewood pile was nearly gone. The last propane delivery had been months ago, and the power flickered until it failed completely by mid-December. Fred rationed his canned food, saving what little meat he had for the coldest nights. He melted snow for water. He never asked for help. Pride or exhaustion, maybe both, kept him silent. Hope stayed near him, always. The dog had grown stronger, fur thicker, eyes more alert. He followed Fred from room to room, but still, he never barked. Fred had started to wonder if he ever would. Then came the storm. Fred had no radio to warn him, but he felt it coming.
From
The
auction
snow came
reject
fast
to
and
farm
thick,
hero.
swallowing the
Follow
farm in
Hope,
white.
the
Temperatures
canine
plummeted.
warrior who
That night,
refused to
bundled
give
in
up.
every layer he owned, Fred stepped into the blizzard
Sold
to check
for
on the
$1.
sheep. Halfway to the barn, his boot caught under a frozen branch, and he fell hard. His shoulder hit the ice with a sickening crack. Pain shot through his chest and the world spun. He tried to move, but couldn't. Snow stung his face and the cold began to seep in deeper with each breath. Inside the house, Hope stirred from the hearth. He lifted his head, ears alert. The wind screamed louder, but something else had changed. He stood, then barked. A short strain sound, but still a bark. Then another. Then he pushed open the door and plunged into the storm. Hope followed Fred's scent, tracking it through the snowdrifts
From
until he
auction
found him,
reject to
half
farm
buried,
hero.
unmoving.
Follow
Hope
Hope,
circled,
the
whining.
canine warrior
Then lay
who
against
refused
Fred's
to give
chest.
up.
When that didn't rouse him, he began to lick Fred's
Sold
face,
for $1.
steady and insistent. Fred groaned, his eyes fluttered open. "Hope!" he whispered. Hope barked again, louder this time. Then he bit gently into Fred's coat and began to pull. Inch by inch, slipping and straining, he dragged Fred toward the house. When they reached the porch, Fred clawed the last few feet with his good arm. Inside, he collapsed by the fire. Hope pressed close beside him. The next morning, Fred's shoulder throbbed, but he was alive, and something had changed. Hope began patrolling the barn each morning. He ran to the pasture and back, circling the sheep. He growled at distant coyotes and started barking when the wind shifted.
From auction
Fred watched
reject
him
to
and
farm
nodded
hero.
silently.
Follow
Then one
Hope,
night just after
the
midnight,
canine
Fred woke to a
warrior
noise he
who
hadn't heard in
refused to
weeks.
give up.
Hope was barking, not softly, not with hesitation.
Sold for
Loud,
$1.
sharp, relentless. Fred rushed to the window. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet moonlit field behind. But near the fence, shadows moved. 4 of them, low, deliberate, wolves. And there, between them and the sheep, stood Hope. Tail high, body rigid, barking like a soldier returned to duty. Fred barely had time to throw on his coat. He grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door and burst outside, boots crunching into the crusted snow. Hope's barking hadn't stopped. It echoed across the field like the voice of something awakened. The cold hit Fred like a wall, but he kept running, heart pounding
From
in his
auction
chest.
reject
The
to
beam of his
farm
flashlight
hero.
scanned wildly
Follow
across
Hope,
the pasture.
the canine
Then he saw
warrior who
them. A pack of
refused to
wolves,
give up.
4 at least, were creeping along the fence line, low to
Sold
the
for
ground,
$1.
eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The sheep huddled together in a corner of the pen, their breaths rising like mist in the air. And there, between the predators and the flock, stood Hope, his posture fierce, shoulders squared, teeth bared, legs braced in the snow. Fred shouted, "Hey, get out of here!" But the wolves didn't flinch. They were hungry, desperate. One of them, larger than the rest, stepped forward. The alpha. Its growl was deep and guttural, a sound that sent a chill down Fred's spine more than the wind ever could. Hope did not wait. With a sudden burst of movement, he lunged
From
at the lead
auction
wolf.
reject
The
to
2 bodies
farm
collided
hero.
in the snow,
Follow Hope,
snarling,
the
thrashing,
canine
teeth
warrior
snapped,
who
claws
refused
tore.
to give up.
Fred screamed and waved his flashlight, trying to distract
Sold
the
for
others,
$1.
but they circled cautiously, watching the fight. The light flickered, then steadied. Fred picked up a shovel that had been left leaning against the fence and banged it against the metal gate. "Back off!" he yelled. "Go on! Get!" The sound startled one of the wolves, who darted back toward the woods. Another followed. But the alpha held its ground, still locked in a furious struggle with Hope. Snow flew in every direction as they rolled and bit and slammed into the frozen earth. Fred's heart twisted at the sight. Then, at last, Hope landed a blow that sent the wolf stumbling backward, bleeding and limping. The alpha growled once more, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. Silence fell. Fred dropped the shovel and ran to Hope. The dog stood panting, his body shaking, blood on his shoulder and along his flank. He looked up at Fred with eyes that still burned with the fire of battle. "Oh God," Fred whispered, dropping to his knees. "You did it. You saved them." He wrapped his arms around Hope, holding him close, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. "You saved my life. You saved this farm." Hope leaned into the embrace, his breath warm against Fred's neck. The next morning, Fred drove into town with Hope in the passenger seat. He stopped at the small veterinary clinic, where the doctor cleaned and stitched Hope's wounds. Word had already started to spread. By the time Fred stopped by the feed store, people were already talking. "You hear about that old German Shepherd? Took on a pack of wolves.
Follow Hope,
Fred Morgan's dog.
Warrior
Heard it dragged him out of a snowstorm last month too." Someone should write about that.
Sold for $1.
Someone did. A local newspaper ran a small article titled "Hope on the Farm." A week later, a reporter from a regional news station came by, asking to take pictures. Fred hesitated, but finally agreed. Hope sat proudly beside him on the porch, bandages still on his shoulder, ears perked toward the wind. Within days, packages began arriving. A fresh bale of hay, a truckload of canned food for both man and dog, new boots, wool blankets, letters with handwritten notes, some from neighbors, others from people as far away as Nebraska and Missouri. "You are not alone," one note read. "That dog is something special. So are you."
Follow Hope,
Fred folded the letter, eyes misting. He looked over at Hope, who was now sleeping peacefully by the fire, his
Sold
chest
for
rising and
$1.
falling in a steady rhythm. For the first time in a long while, the house no longer felt empty. By late March, the snow began to melt. Small streams of water trickled down from the hills behind the farm, carving new paths through the fields where the earth slowly began to breathe again. The skies were bluer, the wind warmer, and the sharpness of winter's grip finally eased. Buds appeared on the apple trees by the old fence line, and Fred could see the green tips of grass breaking through the soil. Near the barn, the sheep had made it through. 3 of the ewes gave birth within a week, tiny wobbly lambs with soft cries that filled the still chilly mornings. Fred worked the fields again, tilling the softened dirt with careful hands and a heart that no longer felt as heavy. There was a rhythm returning to life, slow but sure, like the turning of the seasons. By late
Sold
March,
for
the snow
$1.
began to melt. Small streams of water trickled down from the hills behind the farm, carving new paths through the fields where the earth slowly began to breathe again. The skies were bluer, the wind warmer, and the sharpness of winter's grip finally eased. Buds appeared on the apple trees by the old fence line, and Fred could see the green tips of grass breaking through the soil. Near the barn, the sheep had made it through. 3 of the ewes gave birth within a week, tiny wobbly lambs with soft cries that filled the still chilly mornings. Fred worked the fields again, tilling the softened dirt with careful hands and a heart that no longer felt as heavy. There was a rhythm returning to life,
From
slow but sure,
reject to
like the
farm
turning
hero.
of the seasons.
Follow Hope,
Hope's wounds
the
healed
canine
steadily.
warrior
The
who
limp in his
refused
back
to
leg
give
became
up.
less noticeable, and within a month, he was
Sold
running
for
again,
$1.
chasing after rabbits with a joy Fred hadn't seen in him before. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined him. Just as Fred's own grief had not disappeared, but no longer ruled him. They were inseparable now. Where Fred went, Hope followed. Morning walks along the pasture, afternoons in the shed, evenings by the fireplace. Hope would rest his head on Fred's boot as they sat together, and sometimes, Fred would reach down and quietly scratch behind his ear. One morning, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a nearby elementary school, inviting Fred and Hope to speak at a spring assembly. The principal had read the article about
From
them
auction
and thought the
reject
children
to
might
farm
find
hero.
inspiration in their
Follow
story.
Hope,
Fred had never
the
spoken in
canine
front of a
warrior
crowd.
who
He had never
refused to
thought of
give up.
himself as someone who had anything worth saying, but something
Sold
about
for
the idea
$1.
stayed with him. A week later, he stood in front of 60 children seated cross-legged in the school gymnasium. Hope sat calmly beside him, tail curled around his paws, ears alert. The room was quiet. Curious eyes watched. Fred cleared his throat, his hands slightly shaking. "I came here today to tell you about a dog," he began, voice soft but steady. "A dog that was once forgotten, just like a lot of things in this world. He was trained to serve, to protect, to be strong. And then one day, they said he was too broken to be useful. They tied him to a post and left him to be sold
From
for
auction
$1.
reject to
He
farm
paused,
hero.
looking down
Follow
at Hope. I bought
the
him,
canine
thinking maybe I could
warrior
give him
who
one
refused
last
to
home.
give up.
But what I didn't know was, he was the one who would end up
Sold
saving
for
me.
$1.
He reminded me that even when life takes everything, your family, your health, your hope, sometimes it only takes one living soul who refuses to give up on you to make you believe again." The room was silent. Even the teacher stood still. Fred looked out at the sea of young faces, then smiled faintly. "I thought I was saving a dog for $1, but he saved me. He gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope." When they left, the children crowded around to pet Hope, laughing and smiling as the dog wagged his tail and nudged their hands. Fred stood by the door and watched, heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Fred and Hope walked through the field behind the farmhouse. The grass was soft beneath their feet, and the light was golden, stretching long shadows across the land. Fred's steps were slower these days, but Hope kept pace beside him, his gait steady, his ears flicking at the sound of birds overhead. When they reached the crest of the hill, Fred stopped. Hope did not. He bounded ahead, tail high, leaping through the tall grass as if it were the first day of spring in his life. For a moment he was weightless, free from pain, free from memory, just a dog in motion, fully alive. Fred smiled, eyes brimming, and whispered into the wind, "Run, boy, you've earned it." Behind him, the farmhouse stood small but steady. The fields stretched wide, full of green, and Hope, the dog once forgotten, now ran through it all like he belonged to every inch of it. Hope does not always bark. Sometimes, it simply walks beside you when no one else will. Fred thought he was giving a forgotten dog a second chance, but in truth, that dog gave him something far greater. A reason to keep going, and a reminder that hope can come in the most unexpected form. And sometimes, that's enough.